August 15, 1945. The day Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio waves throughout Japan, announcing unconditional surrender. Across the Pacific, in a dusty prisoner of war camp outside Amarillo, Texas, Captain Dwight Collier stood on the wooden platform of the camp's receiving area, watching an approaching military transport truck with growing apprehension. He had overseen German and Italian prisoners for 2 years without incident. But what was arriving today was something entirely unprecedented in American military history. The truck rolled to a stop in a cloud of Texas dust, and 24 Japanese women stepped down onto American soil as prisoners of war. They wore the remnants of their auxiliary uniforms, gray and worn, from months of retreat through the Pacific Islands. Their faces were composed masks, eyes fixed straight ahead, revealing nothing of the fear or shame they must have felt. Captain Collier had received the urgent telegram from Washington only 3 days earlier, giving him barely enough time to prepare a separate barracks and assign Lieutenant Vera Paulson as the primary liaison officer. Among the women was 23-year-old Fumiko Hayashi, a former radio operator who had been captured in the Philippines during the final chaotic weeks of the Pacific Campaign. She stood slightly apart from the others, her small frame rigid with military discipline despite the August heat. In her pocket, wrapped carefully in cloth, she carried a single photograph of her family in Kyoto, taken before the war had consumed everything she knew. It was the only possession she had managed to keep through her capture and the long journey to Texas. Lieutenant Vera Paulson, one of only 3 female officers at the facility, stepped forward to address the new arrivals. She had volunteered for this assignment, believing that women prisoners would respond better to another woman's authority. But as she looked at the faces before her, she saw something that troubled her deeply. These weren't the defiant expressions of enemy soldiers who believed they would eventually be rescued. These were the faces of people who had already accepted death as their fate, and were somehow bewildered that they remained alive. The Japanese military code they had been raised with left no room for the concept of honorable surrender. To be captured alive was the ultimate shame, a disgrace that extended to their families back home. Fumiko knew this as well as any of them. She had been taught since childhood that death was preferable to capture, yet here she stood, alive and imprisoned, facing an uncertain future that her entire cultural upbringing had told her she should never have reached. The other women maintained their silent formation, their eyes never meeting those of their American captors. Toshiko Matsuda, at 27 the eldest among them, stood at attention with the bearing of someone who had accepted her fate with stoic resignation. Young Emiko Fujimoto, barely 19, kept her gaze fixed on the dusty ground. Private Eugene Whitmore, a lanky farm boy from Alabama who had been assigned guard duty, shifted uncomfortably as he watched the scene unfold. He had never seen Japanese people before, let alone Japanese women. Everything he knew about the enemy came from newsreels and propaganda posters that portrayed them as fanatics incapable of human emotion. But standing before him now were young women who looked exhausted, frightened, and utterly lost. The first 3 weeks at the Texas camp passed in a silence so profound it unsettled even the most experienced guards. The Japanese women moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, maintaining military discipline despite their status as prisoners. They rose before dawn, stood for morning formation, and performed assigned cleaning duties without a single word of complaint or conversation. Their faces remained expressionless masks, revealing nothing of their inner thoughts or feelings. Fumiko had become the unofficial leader among the prisoners, though no formal hierarchy had been established. The other women looked to her for subtle cues about how to respond to American instructions, watching her carefully before making any movement themselves. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, using the bare minimum of English words she had learned during her radio operator training. Yes, no, understood. Her vocabulary extended no further than military necessities. Lieutenant Vera Paulson found the silence more challenging than outright hostility would have been. She had dealt with defiant German prisoners who argued about work assignments and complained about conditions. She understood anger and resentment. But this quiet resignation, this complete emotional withdrawal, left her feeling helpless. The women ate their meals in absolute silence, sitting in perfectly straight rows at the mess hall tables. They never looked at the American food with curiosity or disgust, simply consumed what was placed before them with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to every task. Captain Collier observed the situation with growing concern. He had read the military briefings about Japanese cultural attitudes toward capture and understood intellectually why these women behaved as they did. But understanding it and witnessing it were entirely different experiences. These prisoners acted as though they were already dead, going through the motions of living without any apparent desire to actually be alive. It was deeply disturbing to watch. Toshiko Matsuda maintained the strictest discipline of all. As the eldest, she felt responsible for preserving their dignity and honor in captivity. She organized their barracks with military precision, ensured that uniforms were kept as neat as possible despite their worn condition, and led them in silent mourning rituals that connected them to their distant homeland. She never smiled, never showed weakness, and demanded the same stoic strength from the younger women under her informal command. Young Emiko Fujimoto struggled the most with this imposed silence. At 19, she had been the baby of her family, accustomed to the warm chaos of her mother's kitchen and the constant chatter of her 3 older sisters. The enforced quiet felt like suffocation, pressing down on her chest until she sometimes forgot how to breathe properly. But she followed Toshiko's example, keeping her emotions locked away behind a carefully maintained facade of calm acceptance. Sachiko Endo, the former nurse, noticed small things the others missed. She saw how Private Whitmore always averted his eyes when distributing supplies, as though looking at them directly would be an intrusion. She observed how Lieutenant Paulson's hands sometimes trembled slightly when she gave instructions, betraying a nervousness the officer tried to hide. These tiny details fascinated her, contradicting everything she had been taught about American cruelty and confidence. The American guards found the women's behavior increasingly unnerving. Corporal Lester Briggs, responsible for logistics, mentioned to Captain Collier that he would prefer managing 100 loud, complaining German prisoners over 24 silent Japanese women. At least you knew where you stood with prisoners who argued and made demands. September arrived with cooler temperatures and a decision from Captain Collier that would change everything. The camp's main kitchen was understaffed, and the German prisoners who had been working there were being transferred to other facilities as part of the repatriation process. Lieutenant Vera Paulson suggested assigning the Japanese women to kitchen duties, reasoning that food preparation might provide them with purposeful work while keeping them in a controlled environment away from the male prisoner population. Fumiko and the other women received their new assignment with the same silent acceptance they showed toward everything else. They were led to the large camp kitchen by Corporal Lester Briggs, who explained the layout and basic procedures through Lieutenant Paulson's careful translations. The kitchen was bigger than any Fumiko had ever seen, with industrial-sized stoves, massive refrigeration units, and storage areas stocked with more food than she had witnessed in the past 2 years combined. It was in that kitchen that the women encountered their first genuine shock since arriving in Texas. Sergeant Opal Mae Thornton, a 42-year-old black woman from Georgia, ran the camp kitchen with the efficiency of a military operation and the soul of a Southern grandmother. She had cooked for 300 men daily for the past 18 months, and she took pride in feeding people properly, regardless of whether they were Americans or prisoners. When Sergeant Thornton first laid eyes on the Japanese women, she saw past their stoic masks to something deeper. She recognized the hollow look of prolonged hunger in their eyes, the slight trembling in their hands that spoke of bodies pushed beyond their limits. These were girls who needed feeding, and Opal Mae Thornton had never in her life turned away from someone who needed a good meal. The women stood in a rigid line as Sergeant Thornton moved among them, assessing each one with the practiced eye of someone who understood both kitchens and human nature. She paused before Fumiko, noting the intelligence in her carefully guarded eyes. This one understands more English than she lets on, Thornton thought. She stopped before young Emiko, whose youth was evident despite her attempts to appear hardened and disciplined. Lieutenant Paulson began explaining the work assignments, but Sergeant Thornton raised her hand gently to interrupt. "These girls going to work in my kitchen, they need to eat first," she said firmly. "Can't have nobody working on an empty stomach, and I can see clear as day they've been running on fumes too long already." Captain Collier, who had accompanied the group, started to object that the prisoners had eaten breakfast according to schedule. Sergeant Thornton fixed him with a look that had cowed sergeants and privates alike over the years. "With respect, Captain, I know the difference between eating enough to survive and eating enough to work. These girls need proper nutrition before they do anything else in my kitchen." What happened next caught everyone off guard. Sergeant Thornton began pulling food from the storage areas, real food in quantities the Japanese women had not seen since before the war. Sergeant Opal Mae Thornton had been cooking since she was 7 years old, learning at her grandmother's side in a small kitchen in rural Georgia. Her grandmother had taught her that food was more than sustenance. It was communication, comfort, and sometimes the only kindness you could offer in a hard world. Now, looking at these 24 Japanese women who moved through her kitchen like ghosts, she decided it was time to speak a language that transcended war and propaganda. She had been planning the menu for weeks, ever since hearing about the unusual prisoners who would be assigned to her kitchen. The regular camp fare was adequate, nutritious but uninspired. Potatoes, bread, beans, and occasional beef served in the most efficient manner possible. But Opal Mae had something different in mind, something that required her to call in a favor from her cousin who worked at a poultry farm outside Amarillo. On a Wednesday morning in mid-September, Sergeant Thornton arrived at the kitchen before dawn with 3 large crates. Inside were 20 fresh chickens, already cleaned and prepared. Private Eugene Whitmore, who had drawn early guard duty, watched with curiosity as she began setting up her workspace with the careful precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Fumiko and the other women arrived for their kitchen shift at 6 o'clock, maintaining their usual silent formation. Sergeant Thornton nodded to them and began demonstrating the day's work, but something was different in her demeanor. She moved with a particular kind of purpose, handling the chickens with an almost reverent care that suggested this meal meant something beyond ordinary camp food. Lieutenant Vera Paulson had stayed to observe the morning's work, curious about how the integration into kitchen duties would proceed. She watched as Sergeant Thornton began teaching the Japanese women basic food preparation techniques, using gestures and simple words to communicate across the language barrier. The women followed instructions with their typical mechanical efficiency, but Paulson noticed their eyes occasionally flickering toward the ingredients with something that might have been confusion or curiosity. Toshiko Matsuda, ever vigilant about maintaining discipline, kept watch over the younger women to ensure they showed no inappropriate emotion or interest. But even she found her attention drawn to the buttermilk and flour mixture Sergeant Thornton was preparing, the careful way she seasoned each piece of chicken with salt, pepper, and spices whose names the Japanese women did not know. Corporal Lester Briggs stopped by the kitchen mid-morning to check on supplies and found himself transfixed by the scene. Sergeant Thornton had set up multiple stations, showing small groups of women different aspects of the preparation. Sachiko Endo was learning to coat the chicken pieces properly. Young Emiko Fujimoto watched intently as the sergeant demonstrated the correct temperature for the cooking oil. Fumiko stood slightly apart, observing everything with the sharp attention of someone who understood that something significant was unfolding, even if she could not yet name what it was. The transformation began not with sight or sound, but with scent. As Sergeant Opal Mae Thornton lowered the first pieces of chicken into the hot oil, a sizzling sound filled the kitchen, followed immediately by an aroma that stopped every Japanese woman in her tracks. The smell of frying chicken, rich with buttermilk and seasoned flour, began spreading through the kitchen and drifting out into the compound beyond. Fumiko had been sorting vegetables at a far counter when the smell reached her. Her hands stilled mid-motion, and for the first time since her capture, something penetrated the protective numbness she had wrapped around herself. The aroma reminded her powerfully of her mother's kitchen in Kyoto, of the fried foods her family would prepare for special celebrations. The specifics were different, the seasonings unfamiliar, but the essence was the same: comfort, home, love expressed through careful preparation of food meant to nourish and delight. Around the kitchen, other women experienced similar reactions. Young Emiko Fujimoto felt tears prick at her eyes before she could stop them. The smell carried her back to her childhood, to her grandmother frying tempura on festival days, to the warmth of family gathered around shared meals. She blinked rapidly, trying to force the tears back, terrified that Toshiko would see this weakness and judge her for it. Even Toshiko Matsuda, who had maintained the strictest emotional discipline, felt something crack inside her chest. She gripped the edge of the counter she was cleaning, her knuckles turning white with the effort of maintaining control. The smell was too much, too evocative of everything they had lost. It spoke of abundance where they had known only scarcity, of care where they had expected only cruelty, of a world where people still had the luxury of cooking food that smelled like this. Sachiko Endo, standing closest to the stove where Sergeant Thornton worked, watched the chicken pieces turn golden brown in the hot oil. The nurse in her noted the careful attention to temperature and timing, the way Sergeant Thornton adjusted the heat to ensure even cooking. But the homesick young woman inside her simply breathed in the aroma and felt something long frozen beginning to thaw. Private Eugene Whitmore, stationed near the kitchen entrance, noticed the change in the Japanese women immediately. Their rigid military postures had softened slightly, their carefully blank expressions showing hairline cracks. Several were breathing more deeply than usual, and he could see their hands trembling. Something about that smell was reaching them in ways that weeks of American kindness and proper treatment had failed to achieve. Lieutenant Vera Paulson observed the scene with growing understanding. Food, she realized, was breaking through barriers that words and gestures could not penetrate. These women had been taught to expect torture and execution from their American captors. Instead, they were being fed. Not just fed, but cooked for with obvious care and attention. The cognitive dissonance was visible on every face, confusion and longing warring with years of indoctrination. Sergeant Thornton continued her work, seemingly oblivious to the emotional earthquake occurring around her. Sergeant Opal Mae Thornton arranged the fried chicken on large serving platters with the same care she had given to its preparation. The golden brown pieces glistened with oil and seasoning, surrounded by sides of mashed potatoes, coleslaw, and fresh biscuits. She had cooked enough to feed the 24 Japanese women properly, portions that would satisfy genuine hunger rather than merely prevent starvation. Lieutenant Vera Paulson helped arrange the women at the long kitchen tables, a departure from their usual mess hall routine. Captain Dwight Collier had been informed of Sergeant Thornton's plan and had given his approval, curious to see whether this gesture would have any effect on the stoic prisoners. Private Eugene Whitmore and Corporal Lester Briggs stood near the doorway, ostensibly on guard duty but actually unable to look away from what was unfolding. The Japanese women sat in their typical rigid formation, backs straight, hands folded in their laps, waiting for permission to eat. Fumiko, as their unspoken leader, watched Sergeant Thornton carefully for cues about proper behavior. The American woman placed platters of chicken on each table, then added bowls of sides and a basket of biscuits still warm from the oven. Sergeant Thornton stepped back and nodded to Lieutenant Paulson, who spoke in careful English. "Please eat. This meal is for you." Fumiko translated quietly into Japanese for those whose English was limited, her voice barely above a whisper. The women hesitated, uncertain. In their experience, such abundance always came with hidden costs or cruel tricks. Nothing this good could be freely given, especially not to prisoners by their enemies. But hunger won over suspicion. Toshiko Matsuda reached forward first, her movements deliberate and dignified. She selected a piece of chicken and took a small, careful bite. The other women watched her reaction with desperate attention. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Toshiko's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. Her eyes closed and a single tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another, then another. That first crack in their emotional armor unleashed a flood. Young Emiko Fujimoto was next, biting into the crispy seasoned chicken and immediately beginning to weep. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her small frame. Sachiko Endo covered her face with her hands as tears streamed between her fingers. Around the tables, all 24 women began to cry. Fumiko took her own piece of chicken with trembling hands. The moment the flavors touched her tongue, something broke inside her that had been holding firm since her capture. The chicken was perfectly cooked, crispy on the outside and tender within, seasoned with a care that spoke of love and tradition. It tasted like every meal her mother had ever prepared, like every moment of safety and belonging she had ever known. She wept openly, no longer caring about dignity or discipline or the shame of showing weakness before their captors. The American personnel watched in stunned silence as 24 Japanese women cried over fried chicken, finally allowing themselves to feel everything they had been suppressing. The crying lasted for nearly 20 minutes, a release of grief and fear and confusion that had been building since long before their capture. When the tears finally subsided, the women continued eating with a desperation that spoke of months of inadequate rations and years of wartime scarcity. They ate every piece of chicken, every spoonful of mashed potatoes, every crumb of biscuit. For the first time since arriving in Texas, they looked like living human beings rather than automated machines, going through the motions of existence. Sergeant Opal Mae Thornton watched them eat with quiet satisfaction, then began cleaning her workspace. She moved efficiently, wiping down surfaces and organizing utensils with practiced ease. Fumiko, who had composed herself enough to function again, stood uncertainly. Something inside her demanded that she acknowledge what had just happened, that she express gratitude for this unexpected kindness. She approached Sergeant Thornton with hesitant steps, searching for adequate English words. "Thank you," Fumiko said softly, bowing deeply in the Japanese manner. "Thank you for cooking." The sergeant looked at her with warm brown eyes that held no judgment, no superiority, just simple human recognition. "You're welcome, child," she replied. "Food should taste like somebody cares. That's what my grandmother taught me, and that's what I'm teaching you." Over the following weeks, Sergeant Thornton began a patient process of teaching the Japanese women her cooking techniques. She started with basic skills, demonstrating proper knife handling, explaining the importance of temperature control, and showing them how to season food properly. But more than techniques, she was teaching them a philosophy about food that contradicted everything their wartime experience had taught them. "Food isn't just fuel," she explained to Fumiko during a quiet morning session, her words carefully simple for the younger woman's English comprehension. "Food is how we show love when words aren't enough. You put care into cooking, and people taste that care. They might not know what they're tasting, but they feel it." Fumiko translated these lessons for the other women, and slowly their approach to kitchen work began to change. They stopped moving mechanically and started paying attention to flavors, textures, and presentation. Toshiko Matsuda discovered an unexpected talent for baking, her precise nature perfectly suited to the exacting measurements required for breads and pastries. Sachiko Endo's medical training gave her an intuitive understanding of food safety and nutrition. Young Emiko Fujimoto found joy in the creative aspects of cooking, arranging plates with artistic care that surprised everyone, including herself. Private Eugene Whitmore noticed the transformation during his regular guard duties. The kitchen that had been silent, except for work sounds, now occasionally carried fragments of conversation, mostly in Japanese, but sometimes in halting English. The women still maintained their discipline, but it was softening around the edges, becoming less about rigid control and more about mutual support and collaboration. Lieutenant Vera Paulson reported to Captain Collier that the kitchen assignment had achieved something weeks of careful treatment had failed to accomplish. October brought cooler weather and devastating news from the Pacific. As American forces occupied Japan and began documenting the conditions they found, reports filtered back through military channels and eventually into newspapers that reached even remote Texas. The Japanese women working in the camp kitchen began encountering these reports through fragments of overheard conversations and occasional newspapers left in common areas. Fumiko found herself confronting information that shattered her understanding of the war she had served. She read accounts of kamikaze pilots, some barely older than young Emiko, sent to certain death. She learned about the widespread starvation among Japanese civilians while military leaders had maintained adequate supplies. Most troubling were the reports about how ordinary Japanese citizens had been taught to fear American occupation, told that capture meant torture, rape, and execution. She sat in the small library area late one evening, staring at a newspaper photograph of emaciated Japanese civilians being fed by American soldiers. The image confused her profoundly. These were the same Americans she had been taught to view as demons, monsters without human compassion. Yet here they were, feeding starving enemies with the same care Sergeant Thornton showed in her kitchen daily. Toshiko Matsuda joined her, moving with the quiet grace that came naturally to her. The older woman looked at the photograph for a long moment before speaking in Japanese. "We were told that surrender meant death. We were told Americans would show no mercy." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Everything we believed was a lie. The realization was spreading through all the women like a slow-moving earthquake, cracking the foundation of everything they had built their identities upon. Sachiko Endo spoke of it during kitchen work one morning, her hands trembling as she chopped vegetables. "My brother died believing he was protecting our family from American cruelty. But there is no cruelty here. What did he die for? What did any of them die for?" Young Emiko struggled most visibly with these revelations. At 19, her worldview had been shaped entirely by wartime propaganda. She had never known a Japan at peace, had never experienced a time when Americans were anything other than the designated enemy. Now she worked daily alongside Americans who treated her with more kindness than her own military leaders had shown. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. Private Eugene Whitmore observed these struggles with growing empathy. He had been raised to hate the Japanese, to view them as inhuman fanatics. But working near these women daily, watching them laugh quietly at Sergeant Thornton's stories, seeing young Emiko's face light up when she successfully prepared a new dish, he could no longer maintain that hatred. They were just people, scared young women caught up in forces beyond their control. Mrs. Beulah Pritchard, a church volunteer from nearby Amarillo, began visiting the camp regularly as part of a religious outreach program. She was a motherly woman in her 50s who brought donated books and writing materials. She noticed immediately the deep shame and confusion the Japanese women carried. "Child," she said to Fumiko, "during one visit, you can't carry guilt for things you never knew about. November brought official word that repatriation procedures would begin for Japanese prisoners across American camps. The announcement created profound turmoil among the 24 women who had spent 3 months working in the Texas kitchen. They gathered in their barracks after the news was delivered, speaking in rapid Japanese about what awaited them if they returned home. Fumiko had been corresponding through the International Red Cross, trying to locate her family in Kyoto. The response that finally arrived in late November devastated her. Her family home had been destroyed in bombing raids. Her father was confirmed dead. Her mother and younger sister were alive but displaced, living in temporary housing with extended family. The Japan she remembered no longer existed. Around her, other women shared similar stories. Toshiko Matsuda had received no response at all to her inquiries about family in Osaka. Sachiko Endo learned that her parents had survived, but her 2 brothers had both died in the final months of the war. Young Emiko Fujimoto discovered her entire neighborhood in Tokyo had been reduced to ash and rubble. The specific details varied, but the essential truth was the same for all of them. They would be returning to a country that bore no resemblance to the homeland they remembered. More troubling was what they had become during their months in American captivity. They had learned to laugh at Sergeant Thornton's stories. They had begun speaking English with growing confidence. They had absorbed lessons about cooking that emphasized joy and care rather than mere efficiency. They had experienced a kind of daily kindness that felt more foreign than the Texas landscape surrounding them. How would they explain this transformation to families who had been taught that surrender was unforgivable shame? Lieutenant Vera Paulson called Fumiko to her office one December morning for a private conversation. The young Japanese woman entered with her typical careful posture, but her eyes showed the strain of recent weeks. Lieutenant Paulson spoke gently, choosing her words with deliberate care. Fumiko, you have a choice to make. Repatriation is not mandatory if you can demonstrate that you have American sponsors willing to support you during a transition period. The words hung in the air between them like an impossible dream. Fumiko's English had improved enough that she understood the full implication immediately. She could stay, not as a prisoner, but as someone building a new life in this strange country that had shown her unexpected humanity. But such a choice felt like betrayal of everything she had been raised to value: loyalty to family, to nation, to the cultural identity that defined who she was. Mrs. Beulah Pritchard had already approached Captain Dwight Collier about sponsoring one of the Japanese women. Her own daughter had died in childbirth 2 years earlier, leaving a hole in her life that volunteer work could not fill. She had been particularly drawn to Fumiko's quiet intelligence and obvious internal struggle. "I have room in my home and in my heart," she told the captain simply. Sergeant Opal Mae Thornton made a similar offer for young Emiko, seeing in the 19-year-old a kindred spirit who truly loved cooking. 1970, 25 years after that transformative day when fried chicken broke through barriers that military protocol could not penetrate. Fumiko Hayashi Pritchard stood in the parking lot of a small restaurant in Amarillo, Texas, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her dress. Her husband waited in the car with their 2 teenage children, giving her space for this deeply personal reunion. She carried a carefully wrapped package containing a handwritten cookbook, recipes collected over 2.5 decades of cooking in her adopted American home. Inside the restaurant, Sergeant Opal Mae Thornton, now 67 years old and long retired from military service, sat waiting. Her hair had gone completely gray, and arthritis had slowed her movements, but her eyes still held the same warmth and wisdom that had reached through propaganda and fear to touch the hearts of 24 Japanese women prisoners. When Fumiko entered, Opal Mae stood with some difficulty, and the 2 women embraced without words, tears flowing freely down both their faces. They had maintained correspondence over the years, letters exchanged across the miles that separated Fumiko's life in California and Opal Mae's retirement in Georgia. But this was their first meeting since 1946, when Fumiko had left the camp to begin her new life as Mrs. Beulah Pritchard's sponsored immigrant. Fumiko had written about her marriage to a third-generation Japanese-American man she met in Los Angeles, about her children who knew only America as home, about the catering business she had built that specialized in fusion cuisine blending Japanese and Southern cooking traditions. Over lunch, they spoke of the other women whose lives had been changed by those months in the Texas camp kitchen. Young Emiko had indeed stayed in America under Sergeant Thornton's sponsorship, eventually opening her own restaurant in Atlanta that became famous for its unique blend of Japanese technique and Southern soul food. Sachiko Endo had returned to Japan but later immigrated back to America as a certified nurse, working in San Francisco hospitals for 30 years. Toshiko Matsuda had chosen repatriation and had written for several years about her work helping to rebuild schools in Osaka before her letters stopped coming. The women who had returned to Japan had carried something precious with them, Fumiko explained. They had taken back the knowledge that former enemies could become friends, that hatred was not inevitable, that small acts of kindness could bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides. Several had written to her over the years describing how that experience had shaped their approach to post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. "But what about you?" Opal Mae asked softly. "Do you regret staying? Do you ever feel you abandoned your homeland?" Fumiko was quiet for a long moment, carefully considering her response. "I learned something in your kitchen that changed everything," she finally said. "I learned that home is not just where you are born. Home is where someone cares enough to cook for you properly, where kindness is given freely, where you are allowed to become more than what circumstances tried to make you." She presented the cookbook to Opal Mae, opening it to show recipes written in both English and Japanese. Every recipe included not just ingredients and techniques, but stories about the people who had taught them or shared them.